We have one more panel. I know I said several occasions there's no ranking between the different goals we have, but I think the work the financial sector has commissioned and is reflected in the blueprint on remedy is a particularly important one. We had a short discussion about figures this morning and the famous 150 billion annual profit and some questions around it, whether that's too much or too little. Well, regardless how you see that, one thing is not included, one aspect is not included in that figure for sure, and that's the lost time and the missed opportunities of victims and survivors. We had a fellow commissioner, James Kofi Annan, who worked with us, Henny and many others in the commission, who was a child slave on a fishery boat on Lake Volta in Ghana for 8 years. I was, I think, 14 or 15 when he was liberated from that situation. That's 8 years without school education. Huge missed opportunities. Nobody is calculating that loss for that. So that's not included in 150 billion. So even if you think 150 is a lot or maybe too much or exaggerated, if we counted in the real loss of victims and survivors, we would even end up with a much higher figure. So, and that's my answer to the excellent question of John this morning, why should that be a priority? We're taking away opportunities and chances, and not only money, but also money of people. That makes, for me, a huge difference. That certainly has convinced me to engage on that subject matter. And there's very little thought and energy on actually reimbursing, giving back that money and that loss to victims. There's very little discussion about remedy. And I think, now this may sound a bit self-congratulatory, but I think it has been groundbreaking what the financial sector has commissioned, financial sector has commissioned done in that regard, under the lead of my predecessor, James Koch, who had very clear and strong and precise views on remedy, and in a large sense. So this is why it was of particular importance to us to have a panel on remedy that my wonderful colleague Leona Vaughan will moderate in a second, but I thought I want to open with those words and just give this particular importance to remedy in a large sense. Leona, you have 5 wonderful panelists here, of which one is physically present. That's Vanessa Vale from HSBC to my right. So I'll just stay on the stage, so not to. So you're not alone on that stage, but I will hand over with you. Thank you for taking on the moderator's role, and wish you good luck with that panel. Leona, all yours.
Thank you, Daniel. Yes, I did a very quick hat change between panels. So welcome everyone to this panel, which relates, as Daniel has said, to Goal 4 of the FAST Blueprint on providing enabling effective remedy. And as your moderator, I would like to add to the context that Daniel has given you there about this important blueprint goal. The UNODC paper on remedies for trafficking survivors in 2016 recommended that business enterprises should conduct human rights due diligence to identify where trafficked labour is used at any stage of their global supply chain, and if trafficked labour is identified, provide remedies to exploited workers. But like Daniel has said, remedy goes much further and beyond what that recommendation gives us to work with. So underpinning the FAST Blueprint Goal 4, there's a recognition that the financial sector links to slavery and trafficking in 3 distinct ways: potentially handling the proceeds of crime, potentially lending to and investing in businesses who rely on slavery for cost reduction and profit, but also that financial exclusion often contributes to and amplifies vulnerability to modern slavery for all groups, including survivors. So remedy is a wide-ranging term. The Protocol on Trafficking in Persons established that states must establish a legal remedy mechanism to provide victims of trafficking with the opportunity to claim compensation. Remedy needs to also encompass the provision of access to legal assistance and support to gain compensation, irrespective of age or immigration status. So for the financial sector, providing compensation to victims and survivors is a primary issue of remediation. It can include awarding assets to victims which have been seized as a result of financial investigations, and it can include specific reparative actions to address other forms of ongoing harm to survivors, such as those that Daniel has covered. But the issue of remedy and reparation goes way beyond that. And to address the multiple aspects to this important area for action, the goal is broken down into immediate interventions to provide and contribute to remedies, but also a forward focus on ideas to initiate, such as use and leverage to enable effective remedy ecosystems. And I welcome, therefore, our fantastic panel to speak on this topic, discussing what progress has been made and what challenges remain in policy and practice for providing and enabling effective remedy for modern slavery and human trafficking harms. Tameya Naji-Payne, who you heard from this morning, is the founder and executive chairperson of Tameya's Cause, a social enterprise that provides trauma-informed employment opportunities for survivors, as well as human trafficking detection training to various sectors. And she's recently launched PC Online Institute. She's assisted in changing several human trafficking related laws and was involved in the creation of Project Protect, a public-private partnership of Canadian financial institutions, regulators, law enforcement agencies, and others. And as was mentioned this morning, Tameya previously served as a financial sector commissioner on modern slavery and human trafficking, which laid the foundation for FAST. I'm also joined by Professor Barry Koch of Barry M. Koch PLLC. Barry is a recognised international expert in anti-money laundering compliance and risk management and serves as an adjunct professor of law at Cardozo Law School. He served as an assistant district attorney and counsel to the investigation division in the New York County District Attorney's Office. He is a founding member of the United States and European Bankers Alliances Against Human Trafficking and was also a financial sector commissioner on modern slavery and human trafficking. I'm also joined by Sarah Crowe of Polaris, and Sarah is Strategic Initiatives Director of Financial Systems for Polaris, which is the leading US nonprofit organisation working on human trafficking. She leads the efforts to partner with the financial services industry to implement a comprehensive and industry-wide strategy to intervene in the crime of human trafficking. And Sarah has previously served in data analysis roles at Polaris and various roles for the US National Human Trafficking Hotline. Now, Barry and Sarah were both instrumental in the creation of the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. And this leads me to introduce Vanessa, who joined you in person. Vanessa is representing HSBC, one of the first banks to create a Survivor bank account. And Vanessa is the Financial Inclusion and Vulnerability Manager there in the section on retail banking and wealth management. And she has been active in spearheading the Survivor Bank initiative. She has also worked in previous roles at HSBC and other financial institutions. And finally, I'll introduce Dr. Mac Darrow. Mac is from the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights Representative in Washington, DC. He previously served as Chief of the Sustainable Development Goals section, managing the OHCHR UNDP Human Rights Strengthening Programme, and consulted with the World Bank on a project utilising international law to address social impacts of climate change. Mac has been instrumental in supporting FAST in outreach to multilateral development banks and international financial institutions. So I thank all of our panelists for joining us. I'm looking forward to their inputs. We will open with Tameya, who will speak about Goal 4 in relation to survivors' needs. We'll then hear about what works and what challenges have arisen in the Survivor Inclusion Initiative and Survivor Bank Account case study from Barry, Sarah and Vanessa. Then we'll close with an overview of approaches to remedy from a business and human rights perspective provided by Mac. We will then open for questions and answers from the floor and from our remote participants. And if you are joining us remotely, please feel free to raise questions in the Q&A box at any point, and we'll return to them in that session. So I will not take any more of your time, and I will hand over to Tameya.
Good afternoon. It's an honor to be with you again. It's lovely to see my fellow commissioner members again, and member on this panel, Barry Koch. It's an incredible topic that we are going to talk about today, and I also don't want to take too much time because I really would like to learn and hear a lot more from Sarah and Barry on the final stages of the survival inclusion initiative. I remember when we actually just started this conversation 2 years ago, Barry was in that room. I believe it was in The Hague. And I just can't believe how far this project went and how much work you guys were able to get done. And for that, I'm just incredibly grateful on behalf of all the other survivors who cannot be here today to thank you. That being said, I would like to just start with a very personal story on why I believe this part of the initiative was so incredibly important and why I'm one of the biggest fan and supporter. I was 21 years old when I was trafficked from Hungary to Canada, and I was kept for 3 months, and it was a short time being sex trafficked, but it was a time that changed my future forever. Short 3 months of being sex trafficked led me to try to rebuild my life for the next 20 years. 20 years. I used to work on 4 jobs because I couldn't get a bank account. I couldn't cash my checks properly. I lost a lot of my money on paychecks while going into institutions like Western Union and losing 30% of my paychecks all the time. I remember I was walking from my workplaces to a grocery store, and there was a homeless person, a Canadian homeless person, and I always give him money, but I asked him, how is it that you are down on your luck, but I feel like that you are more luckier than I am, and I would like to learn from you. And he looked at me and he said, what do you mean I'm luckier than you? I'm homeless and you have a place to live. And I said, you have a wallet, you are a person in society, you're still a person, you have one bank card, you have an OHIP, which is a health card, you have a social insurance number, which all means that you're a person. As far as society concerned, you exist. As far as society concerned, I'm a ghost. I couldn't get a bank card, even when eventually I got a bank card. I wasn't able to apply for a credit. I was a nobody in a system. I was a nobody for many years. And let me tell you what that means when you're nobody in the system. You can't get an apartment. You can't get anything. You can't get a credit card. You can't start building your credit because you're a nobody. So nobody wants to give you that first shot. I had no criminal record. I've done absolutely nothing wrong, except I didn't have proper documentations yet in Canada. So that being said, for many, many years, I was relying on friends, boyfriends, individuals, my bosses, to sign papers for me. I was probably 35 years old when for the first time, a landlord didn't ask me for a co-signer, 35 years old. That means that every single time I had to have an interaction with banks, trying to move on, trying to get further, I was always reminded that I'm still just a nobody in a system and I haven't really made it further. In the meantime, in real life, not in a machine and not in a score system, I finished a couple of certificates because I still couldn't go to school because I couldn't access the student loans. I taught myself English, both speaking and writing. I had management jobs. I was able to start volunteering for police agencies and stuff, but every time I still went back to the banking system for asking for something, I still felt this tiny little. The happy ending of that story is after many years of hard work, I rebuilt my credit. And at the age of 44, 2 weeks ago, I was able to buy my very first car by myself without a co-signer. And let me tell you how weird of a feeling that was sitting in the office in a finance office in car dealership with my husband next to me. And they give me this piece of paper where I signed as a main lender or loaner. And there's a co-signer space and it's completely empty. And I had tears coming out of my eyes. And my husband, he knew the story, but the lady didn't. 44. So it's not, I mean, it's third world problems, right? I mean, other survivors can't even eat for 10 years. And that's not really the point of the story. The point is that in countries where the financial system is basically dictating your future in one way or another, I think it is so incredibly amazing to see that the financial sectors are actually coming together due to the initiative, due to the hard work, seeing leaders like HSBC or Scotiabank in Canada who decided to put an end to that nonsense and start offering help for survivors. So I think the initiative that we started is so much needed. I think financial sectors will have so many ways and opportunities to help the survivors to reintegrate so much faster. Just like Dania said, if I would have had the chance 15 or 20 years ago to become a healthy member of society, I would have started contributing sooner. When I felt like I'm part of the system, then within the system, I can start contributing sooner. So 7 years ago, I started a company. And for the last 2 to 3 years, we've been paying some incredible amount of taxes to Canada. I hired survivors of human trafficking to help us to do the work that we are doing. Our survival educators now have consistent income, which I knew how important was that when you start rebuilding your credit. A couple of survival educators now got a car loan because of the consistency that we were able to provide and because of our work with the financial sector. And now we understand how do you build your credit and how. So it's not just a human story. It's not just an inspirational, motivational story, but it's also what Danielle explained earlier. And I'm really glad that he said that. If you help us to get back into society sooner, we would love to contribute and become a part of it. We want to be nurses, police officers, lawyers, security guards, teachers, bankers, or silly CEOs and speakers like me. So that being said, I think just a couple of more things or areas where it could use a little bit of a improvement, not specifically this inclusion, but overall when we're talking about what sectors can do. I think if more banks could come together and start offering a reintegration process to survivors, offering them bank cards, bank accounts, in a way that it's safe for the bank and safe for the survivors, I think that would be incredible. I also think that the credit card companies and a credit score monitor companies, if they could come and join this fight, that would be incredible. Equifax, TransUnion in North America, and not sure what's the equivalence to that in Europe, because it's one thing to have a bank card, but the other is incredible if we could start getting help to rebuild our credit where we are completely blacklisted constantly. So that's basically in a nutshell how I felt when we started this survival inclusion initiative. I felt so incredibly hopeful when I knew that it's going to land on the desk of Barry, and I learned that Polaris Project came on board as well, and I was incredibly grateful when I learned that HSBC became one of the leader financial sector to head this up. That being said, I would love to thank you very much for listening to our side of the story, and I would like to hand over back the screen to our colleagues so we can learn all the incredible work that you guys were able to do in just a short period of 2 years. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Tamaya. Thank you. I think that it's incredibly important that we begin with your story and your experience, your lived experience, as well as how we've tried to respond to that with the Survivor Inclusion Initiative and how much further we need to go. So I'll hand over at this point to Barry and Sarah, who can speak to the history of the initiative and what is happening at the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Leona. Hello, everyone. Nice to see a few familiar faces. I wish I could be there in person with you, but perhaps next year. So I was a commissioner on the Liechtenstein Initiative, the original Financial Sector Commission, and I was asked to speak about the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. And just a quick word about my anti-trafficking work, because it had a direct impact on our ability to bring together the banks. My anti-trafficking work has largely been from the perspective of the financial sector. I was the head of the global anti-money laundering program at a large international company. I was the chief compliance officer at a larger international company, and I was chief counsel for anti-money laundering at one of the world's largest banks. And as Leona mentioned, I'm a former assistant district attorney here in New York. I do expert witness work in money laundering and financial crimes cases like identity theft and cybercrime and elder abuse. And most recently, I've been working with some not-for-profit startups doing some really brilliant work, scraping the dark web for data points that have confirmed connections to labor trafficking and sex trafficking, and we provide that data free of charge to law enforcement. I would like to just say a quick word about a point that Daniel mentioned about the $150 billion industry. I personally believe that 150 billion is a low number, but I want to mention something because some of that money went through the financial institutions where I worked and where friends and colleagues worked. And just a comment that, besides the moral imperative that we all share to eradicate trafficking, but trafficking is bad for the global economy on a macro level. It depresses innovation by destroying human potential. It fuels corruption and the flow of illicit funds, some of that through the banks where I worked. It deprives governments of tax revenues, which should be intuitive to everyone, and is one of the easier ones to measure. And it disrupts the efficient deployment of human capital. So when we talk about measuring the size of this business, it is actually a complex calculation, but I believe it's considerably larger than 150 billion and has macro impacts on the global economy. So in the early days of the commission, we understood that there was a need to help survivors get reintegrated into mainstream financial services. You heard Timea talk about some of that. We understood that for those victims who were lucky enough to escape, they often discovered that their identities had been hijacked by their traffickers, and their traffickers had committed crimes in their names. And this, of course, meant that their credit histories were adversely affected, which in turn meant that it could be difficult to get a job or rent an apartment or open a bank account, all of which increased their vulnerability to being re-victimized. So we brought together a consortium of some of the world's largest banks. Originally, it was in the US, the UK, Canada, and Central and Eastern Europe. And we brought together a group of victim service providers, and we created the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. I should mention that it's a really great illustration of this theme of partnership, the public-private partnership and the partnership that the financial industry had with Polaris in this case. We created the SII, and under the SII, we provided, and the banks agreed, that confirmed survivors of trafficking would be eligible to open simple savings and checking accounts. In the US, we have a geographic distribution of banks. We have branches in the Northeast, in the Midwest, on the West Coast, in the South. We even have an online bank with no branch network at all. It's entirely online, and that's not by accident. We wanted to provide an option for survivors to open accounts without the need for a face-to-face interview with branch personnel. And this reflects the victim-centric approach that we tried to pursue from the outset. I personally believe that the program has had some great successes, but we also face some challenges if we're going to be successful at sustaining the program and growing the program. And I'll talk about some of the big successes first. First of all, it's really gratifying, very rewarding to be able to say that we proved the concept. In the aggregate, we have opened collectively approximately 2,000 accounts. And when I say that, I have to acknowledge that HSBC has, right from day one, been the leader. They've been out in front of all the other banks, and they deserve special acknowledgement, as does Scotiabank in Canada, but HSBC has really set the bar for everybody else in terms of opening accounts for survivors. And having opened 2,000 accounts approximately, this, I believe, provides survivors with increased independence and agency, and it reduces their vulnerability to being re-trafficked. Some of the banks have made a business decision to grow the product offerings for this group of customers, and they will offer products such as life insurance, auto loans, education loans, home loans. This responds to a question that I see in the queue from Teresa Forbes, a more holistic approach. And I'm encouraged to see that some of the banks have actually decided, they've made a business decision that they want to expand their offerings to things like those that I mentioned: life insurance, auto loans, education loans, and home loans. We've also hosted programs on financial literacy. Sarah will speak about that in more detail. And we've had the support of financial industry regulators, which has helped us address some of the legal and compliance issues that tend to arise with this population. For example, documentation requirements. Victims often report, and this didn't come as a surprise to us, we knew we would have to address this. Victims often report that their traffickers confiscated their passport, or they don't have a current driver's license, and that they are concerned, therefore, that they're not able to provide identification documents, and the banks won't accept them as customers. We have found successful alternatives, successful resolutions to these challenges. For example, we have addressed situations where law firms who are representing some of the survivors in immigration proceedings have submitted a letter to the bank on the law firm letterhead saying that the survivor is in fact a client of the law firm, which the banks will consider to be sufficient identity verification, documentary verification. There's a program that Homeland Security runs called the Continuous Presence Program, which is something that provides a similar type of verification from the government without the survivor having to produce a passport or driver's license. There's a New York City ID program where you can get government issued photo ID from the city of New York. And so we've had some good successes addressing those issues. We've also encountered issues with the requirement to provide a physical street address when the survivor is residing in a safe house and can't safely reveal her address. And we've had some instances where we have successfully addressed the bank's concern about an applicant's prior criminal record. Typically, that's an arrest for prostitution, and the banks understand, these banks do because they're part of the program, and we've spent a fair amount of time educating them, that these individuals who have been arrested for prostitution have been trafficked, and in fact, they are victims and not criminals. Some of the challenges facing us: we don't have a sufficiently large population of victim service providers to make the referrals to the banks. We have lots of banks with lots of capacity, but obviously the business model is not one where we advertise the product to the public. Rather, we work with targeted victim service providers who work with their clients when making referrals to the banks, and we don't have enough of them in the network. So we've set out on a project to expand that provider network. We recently took raw data supplied to us by Polaris and we created a database of approximately 650 US service providers. We segmented them into 3 tiers based on the size of their organization, the number of victims they support, financial capabilities, NGO accreditation, prior work with not-for-profit organizations. You get the idea. And we enhanced that raw data by adding contact details for all of the organizations. We added websites and the like. And we recently reached out to a group of that 650, and we hosted 4 webinars. We had 25 service provider organizations participating. And during the webinars, we described the program. We're following up with them now to facilitate their joining the initiative as appropriate. The ones who should join, we're hoping they will, and we're following up on that now. During those webinars, we explained and emphasized some of the key aspects of the program, like the fact that the relationship between the survivor and the bank is entitled to all customer privacy and confidentiality laws that apply to the bank's relationships with all of its other customers. We plan to host several more of these webinars with the objective of increasing the referral pipeline. This is the single most critical dependency for the program in the US, and it's the highest priority. I'm cautiously optimistic that we can succeed at this. It will require a dedicated resource, which I'm told is the plan, and sustained attention to building the network. And just to finish up for the future, we've been having some discussions about geographic expansion to Latin America. We've had some discussions about offering pro bono legal services for things like credit repair. You heard Tamea refer to that. That's obviously a need, and there are ways to address that and bring some solutions to that. And we continue to offer information and webinars addressing financial literacy, which Sarah will also address in more detail. So that's it for me. And Leona, I'll hand it back to you. Thank you all.
Thank you, Barry. I will pass the baton quickly on to Sarah so she can add her perspective from Polaris.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so sorry not to be able to join you in person. I was really looking forward to it. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Sarah Crowe, and I work at Polaris, which is a US-based nonprofit working to end sex and labor trafficking. Our geographic focus is primarily the United States and North America, but we do have a number of areas of work in which we do more international work as well. Today, I lead Polaris's work to leverage the influence, expertise, and motivation of the financial services industry to address trafficking. But more than 10 years ago, I began my work at Polaris on the US National Human Trafficking Hotline. And I wanted to take kind of a moment to talk about my experiences there and really why that led me to be so excited and enthusiastic about the Survivor Inclusion Initiative. So the US National Human Trafficking Hotline is a 24-hour confidential hotline where survivors and victims can reach out to get connected to support in their local community. So it might be shelter, it could be counseling. They may call just to kind of talk through their options, figure out what's available for them, or connect with specialized law enforcement on the ground. And we do, facilitate those reports to law enforcement. But a lot of the work is really connecting survivors to social support organizations that are on the ground, which is why we maintain this referral directory. During that time, I spoke to a lot of individuals who were in all different kind of phases of their life and their journey. Some were in trafficking situations and wanting to talk through what options would be available if they chose to leave. Others were in situations of crisis where there was a really dangerous situation and they needed an immediate response. But I think the majority of survivors I spoke to had already taken steps to leave their trafficking situation and were now working through that really hard process of establishing a safe and stable life. And I think Tamea did a great job of speaking to that, because when you exit a trafficking situation, it's not over. There's a long process of recovery that comes next, and survivors really have to lead that work and are so resilient in doing so. During that time, there are many challenges that are faced. So many survivors, maybe they left their last place of residence, so they don't have a stable address. They maybe left all of their social contacts. They may not have a source of income. They may have a criminal history. They may not have an ID. Their identity may have been stolen and misused by their traffickers. So getting access to a bank account can be really challenging. And for those of us who have always had access to financial services, I think it's easy to take something like a bank account for granted. But there have been so many stories, and to me this was another story that really highlights the need for something like a bank account. So I have heard of survivors that did get a new job, a safe employment option, and then had their start dates delayed again and again because the company insisted on paying through direct deposit and they didn't have a bank account. I've heard of survivors who actually did get a court-ordered restitution settlement. That's not a frequent occurrence by any means. That's a huge deal to get restitution money and to actually have it paid out to the survivor. But they again didn't have a bank account, so they're walking around with a check for maybe $100,000. They could try and cash a check like that, and God only knows the fees that they have, but nobody wants to carry around that much cash, so they actually hold on to the cash and wait, or the check and wait. And this is money that is incredibly critical to them building a safe place for themselves. So this is a really big deal and it has serious implications for survivors. And a lot of my job on the hotline was to let people know what options were available, give them some guidance on how to navigate those systems, and then most importantly, connect survivors to support organizations on the ground who could really walk beside the survivor over a longer period of time to navigate these complex bureaucratic systems. Navigating these complicated systems can honestly be a full-time job. I think it's hard to understand how bureaucratic and time-consuming that can be. Each process can be kind of a gauntlet of itself. There are more obstacles to overcome. For many survivors who have had a lot of trauma, rather than being able to take some time to process that trauma and to heal, they're having to scramble to work through all of these bureaucratic systems just to get these kind of basic necessities in place. And that's something that's always really stayed with me, and something that I thought, if I ever had the opportunity to make a difference, to make any of those systems a little bit easier, more accommodating for survivors, that was something that I was going to be very motivated to participate in. So that's really where the Survivor Inclusion Initiative comes in. I think everyone in this audience understands why there are regulations and requirements around opening a bank account. I'm sure the compliance panel can educate you on this topic if you're not aware. And I do a lot of work related to AML, so I completely agree these things are very important. And none of these regulations were set up with the purpose of excluding vulnerable communities. And what I've learned from this initiative is that in many instances, the regulations are written in such a way that those accommodations can be made for people with special circumstances. But the average person is not keeping up with AML regulations and doesn't necessarily know all of that. So it can seem really impossible from the outside. So, the work here with the SII was really to connect the social support organizations that are working with survivors directly on the ground with financial institutions who are willing to go through those processes. And we'll hear from Vanessa in a moment, and really navigate, what accommodations can be made. How can we make these accounts available to as many individuals as possible? So as Barry talked about, we're continuing to grow this pipeline, and we've worked to develop a number of resources to help survivor support organizations and banks. So for instance, FAST has hosted a webinar for banks on trauma and how to think about creating a trauma-informed process within a bank. There are resources on what forms of identification can be used, so that caseworkers kind of know how to help prepare their clients for that account opening process. There's financial literacy resources that are being worked on and have been put out for survivors to help understand that bank account and the kind of the requirements associated with it. So I'm really proud of the foundation that has been laid, and very excited to see this project grow. But in the spirit of this being a review conference, I have a couple of lessons learned to reflect upon. The first is, I think with each jurisdiction that the SII expands to, time really needs to be spent to understand the special circumstances within that jurisdiction and on the ground, and maybe to adjust the model accordingly. So for instance, in the United States, as Barry spoke about, we've had an issue building out the referral directory. I think we greatly underestimated how much time it would take. And that's because the US has a very decentralized system of providing services to survivors. It has actually many services available, but they're not through any sort of centralized place. The response is really made up of hundreds of small nonprofits across the country. And these organizations can be really small. They have a huge demand for service and they have a lot of turnover. So, onboarding a survivor support organization is great, but if the case manager who's aware of the survivor inclusion initiative leaves, how do you ensure that that information is passed on to other case managers at that organization? We've really struggled with that. And I do think that's partially because the US has this more decentralized system than some of the other jurisdictions that have been participating. And I believe that that's probably going to be the case in other jurisdictions that are worked in as well. And there may be jurisdictions where there are very few human trafficking specific service providers. So we may also need to think about what are the service providers that serve kind of related populations, and make sure that they're included. Secondly, and this is really aimed at those who work within financial systems, I think we should never forget how opaque the financial systems is to outsiders. Financial institutions are really reluctant to provide very detailed information about certain policies and procedures. So for survivors and advocates trying to navigate that system, it's really hard to understand what is actually possible, what is restricted or prohibited, and what is really needed to gain access. And that's something that we need to continue to share information about that whenever possible. That's closely related to my third point, which is it's extremely important to get regulators involved. Even when regulators have issued guidance about particular rules in the past, I've learned that banks want very explicit approval from regulators for very specific circumstances. So the more explicit the guidance, the better. And then finally, it's absolutely critical that survivors shape this program and all programs in the anti-trafficking space. And this is, not necessarily based on this initiative particularly, because I know that we've done a lot to engage survivors in shaping the initiative, but it's something to be constantly vigilant about. The anti-trafficking movement broadly has not necessarily always been led by survivors. And so people without lived experience have had to make decisions about what survivors need or want. Sometimes this means guessing. They may be educated guesses, but they're guesses nonetheless. I think we need to hear directly from survivors about the needs they're articulating and partner with them to design solutions that are really going to work. In terms of what is next, I think we have heard overwhelmingly from survivors that bank accounts are critical, but we need to expand beyond that. What are all the financial services that someone needs? So lines of credit, business loans, financial planning. How do you think about planning for retirement? Survivors need all of that support. And I think we need to continue to innovate and create solutions for special problems faced by survivors. Both Barry and Maya talked about credit scores. I have learned that these might be kind of unique to Canada and the United States. But I'm sure there are many other issues as well. After someone exits a trafficking situation, they have this financial history that stays with them. Their identity may have been used, and navigating those systems to get that repaired is extremely challenging. So we absolutely need the credit bureaus involved. We need others involved in those systems to make sure that that's really working. And with that, I will turn it back over to Leona to continue the discussion.
Thank you, Sarah. So I think, as Sarah mentioned, we do have Vanessa Whale with us, with you physically in Liechtenstein, and Vanessa will speak to the HSBC Survivor Bank account and the experiences and lessons learned from this initiative. So over to you, Vanessa.
I'm conscious that Barry and Sarah have obviously spoken quite a lot to the Survivor Inclusionist Initiative and the Survivor Bank, so my notes may repeat them, but at least that shows that we're on the same page and we're aligned, which is a positive thing. So thanks ever so much for allowing me to be here today. It really is a privilege to be here. HSBC has led many initiatives in the financial crime space previously to primarily create, test and publish financial crime related human trafficking indicators for UK and Europe. And has been successful in raising awareness across delivering workshops, etc. What we wanted to do as part of the Inclusion Initiative was to understand what we could do to support the survivors. So we identified that trafficked people were still being treated as criminals through their potential arrest, detainment and subsequent legal proceedings. And as a consequence, they were totally omitted from for having access to the financial service or financial system, which ultimately pushed them back into that cycle of abuse and trafficking. So it was a self-perpetuating cycle. And as much as we were doing everything, or felt we were doing everything we could in the financial crime space in regards to identification and prevention across our branch network and our frontline staff and all our subsequent policies and procedures, we identified that there was really a massive gap here that we needed to try and support and join the plight to end that, really. So back in 2018, quite ironic actually, I was looking for a notepad and I picked up this notepad and the first page that it came to was my notes from my very first conversation that I had with one of the charity workers at the Salvation Army back in 2018. And also I visited a couple of safe houses in Manchester and subsequent areas, and there was a couple of notes in there and I was like, oh, how weird is that? Actually, that's the first time I picked up this notebook and I'm going to be using it again three years later, so it was a little bit of a nice moment yesterday seeing that. So we created the Survivor Bank initiative. We've kind of named it, the name's evolved into Survivor Bank. Back in 2018 with a pilot with two of our banks in the UK. So this is HSBC UK that we're talking about in our retail banking arm. We worked very, very closely with the Salvation Army, who held the government contract for rehabilitation of human trafficking in England at the time. And we needed to find out how we could actually get over some of these barriers that we've spoken about around standard documentation that banks do require. It was a very difficult and challenging time, I would say. It was myself and a gentleman who worked in the financial crime risk team who no longer works for HSBC at the time. And he spoke to me and said, what can we do in this area to support? And I think at the time, when I spoke to a few people in our team, it was like, Vanessa, that's never going to happen. We are never, ever going to provide access to banking for people who cannot provide the appropriate documentation. Go away type thing. But what we needed to do was really get across to our internal stakeholders that we need to, and I think somebody used the phrase, well, we need to actually, if we're going to be honest and true to what we're saying we support, we need to demonstrate the actions and outcomes. And we need to be bold, and we need to be brave, and we need to really challenge the status quo is the way I see it, as I saw it happen. So the Survivor Bank initiative is really aimed at supporting survivors in their efforts to be integrated back in society through the provision of access to a banking, despite the abuse and the fraud and some of the things that the guys previously have referred to in regards to identity theft and false use of names, etc. The pilot was deemed successful, and this was another thing. We went through a lot of post-implementation reviews where I had to sit in front of many people saying, well, how many accounts have we opened? How do we, how successful is it? Well, we've opened one in Nottingham. Well, that's not very successful. Well, it is. We've changed somebody's life. That's, for me, that is a successful pilot. And we had to get around and try and move people's focus and thought process away from figures, numbers, making money, because originally that's what the banks were associated with. And they'd say, well, we can't invest this because of X, Y, and Z, and everything's priority, everything has to get prioritised to get resource allocated to it. And my response is quite simple. When we used to we have to fill in a lot of forms, as you can probably imagine, to get our projects even on the runway. And around the kind of return on investment form, I always used to leave it blank, and I used to get told off. And I used to say it's the right thing to do. And it is as simple as that. And I think I had to be really resilient and really forthright and really believe in what I was wanting to do to get this pilot off the ground. So it was deemed a successful pilot, thankfully, and I think we opened 4 accounts over the course of a month. But we had to work really, really closely in collaboration with the Salvation Army, and work really, really closely with our internal stakeholders to make sure that they were comfortable with the process that we'd implemented, to make sure that we had all the correct governance in sight. There were probably daily calls to discuss outputs, etc., to ensure that all the relevant stakeholders were comfortable with what was happening, and ultimately that we were supporting customers on this journey that was new to them and new to us, and supporting our guys at the front line as well. Thinking about the barriers that we faced, obviously the identification and verification of address was one of the primary barriers, because that is our standard requirement for documentation to open a bank account. And this is a basic bank account, so there's no lending attached to it. It is just the basic bank account, but even so. We had to, the way we got around that was we had not got around, that sounds terrible, the way we managed to mitigate that risk was we worked very closely with our financial crime compliance teams, fraud teams, to really understand what is it that we could accept that would be that would mitigate that risk, make people comfortable, but also allow that to happen. So we agreed on a letter, which I think somebody referenced previously, that was acceptable, that came from us to our charity partner. There was an audit trail on the letter, so we could tell exactly where it had come from with the Salvation Army. And then a support worker from the Salvation Army would actually accompany the applicant into the branch with them. I then was thinking, well, actually, that's a risk there in itself, because how do we know that they're not the trafficker, and actually they're coercing them in branch? So there was that uncomfortable moment and then we were like, no, actually what we can do is we can ask them to bring identification, photo ID, so that's what they do. And obviously we monitored everything, and we had specific members of staff in the branch network who could only look after these appointments. There was many times when people didn't turn up for appointments. It didn't matter if they didn't keep them. These people have led chaotic lives. They were really, really scared to come into branch. Following on from that, we were given the go-ahead to expand the service across further branches. So we are now in, and I always get my figures wrong, 145 champion branches we have in our UK. So we've got 145 HSBC UK branches that will support and open accounts for, or have appointments to open accounts for survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery. And we have opened just over 1,500 accounts for survivors of human trafficking and modern slavery. We are extremely passionate and proud about this initiative, and it is not going to end here. And I'm so pleased to kind of be part of what can we do next, because that's always my question. Well, we're doing this now, but what else can we do to help these people? And when I used to talk about the Survive Bank initiative, I usually say it's the kind of, they have this amazing support from the charities. They do so much work to support them. They are absolutely phenomenal. And actually the missing piece of the jigsaw puzzle is this bank account, which seems so simple. And so I'm so proud that we've been able to, and will continue to support people. All of our guys who, in the branch network, who are survivor champions, they are selected and they opt because they have certain empathy skills, they have certain experiences themselves, they want to be involved, they have specialist training, they have face-to-face training with charities, they have face-to-face training with champions within HSBC UK, and they also have the mandatory FCC training, which obviously all of our guys have over 3 months. I think some of the key factors of success to Survivor Bank, For me, the primary one would be collaboration. So our collaboration with our external partners and charities was key. Trust, transparency, regular communication. They had to trust, that when they're bringing their client who is so vulnerable into one of our branches, they are so scared that the people they're going to speak to are going to really look after them. And that really only translates and becomes true when they've experienced it. So sharing their experiences has also been key to encourage other people to come forwards. And also then collaboration internally across our teams. At the outset, it was really challenging in 2018, but now everybody is acutely aware of our work with Survivor Bank. I also engaged our trade body, UK Finance, and went to them and presented to our peers to basically encourage everybody else to get on board. So Barclays, everybody else, if everybody gets on board and offers this service, then there is more exposure and there's more support available to more people. And also we talk about regulators. We've had meetings with the FCA in regards to our work on Survivor Bank, where we've had to present what we've done, and they have challenged us, as you would expect, quite rightly so, and we will keep in touch with them and continue to share our work. Future, we spoke about future. We have a plan to continue our expansion with the Survivor Bank branches so that we have representation in every county. We are looking at how we can support with the financial education. We have a separate team. My team is the financial inclusion and vulnerability team. There is a separate team in HSBC on so looks after financial education. So we're looking at what else we can do with that appointment. So they don't have the bank account and they go. How else do we facilitate that progress of them and that rehabilitation back in society? That is an ongoing program that we have. And then really how else can we support? So future lending, is that a potential when we've seen that those bank accounts are actually operating in the way that we would want them to, then why not move on to a mortgage or whatever that may look like. And then really as well, I think that my role as well is about raising raising awareness across the industry so that we can get more people on board to support us, and really looking at, like we were talking about, across different industries as well. It doesn't just have to be in the banking industry. And just then to finish, we've had some great external recognition around the work that we've done. We were a winner of the Stop Slavery Innovation Award in February 2020, Thomas Reuters Foundation. We won the Best Bank of the Year 2019 for Survivor Bank at the Banker, which was lovely. I'd missed all of these awards, by the way. And we were shortlisted for the Changing Lives category at Human Trafficking and Slavery Day Awards at the Houses of Parliament. But for me, the most important feedback is our customer feedback. And we are told daily that we are just changing lives, and to me that is all that we can do and hopefully continue to do. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Vanessa. I think that what we've heard so far has been a story of success in terms of focusing on the reintegration of survivors as a form of remedy. It's really important work. It's a really important aspect of our work, but it's not the only aspect of remedy, as I pointed out at the beginning of the panel. If we think about the most recent scenarios, for example, 2018, Western Union were fined $60 million for violating anti-money trafficking laws in New York, which may have enabled human trafficking. And this year, the UN Human Rights Office issued advice confirming that banks do have responsibilities when it comes to the impact of companies in which they hold shares on behalf of clients. And this followed a partial upholding of, by the Swiss National Contact Point of a complaint against UBS and Hikvision, a company accused of evading Uyghur exploitation and surveillance in China. So on that basis, I now bring in my colleague, Mac Darrow. Now, Mac is going to talk, he's going to give us an overview of the current research and approaches to remedy in development finance institutions, emerging lessons and areas for future action and attention, which will help us to consider how we take this success and we build on it going forwards. Over to you, Mac.
Thanks very much, Leona, and hi, everybody. I'm really pleased to be part of this conversation. Thanks for the intro, for the invitation to it. And I look with envy at a room full of living human beings, and really look forward to being part of the discussion, perhaps going forward in a more personal setting. As Leona mentioned, I'm a newcomer to this discussion, this fantastic and vital discussion. I handle our work on TFIs, bilateral, multilateral development finance institutions globally, and did have the pleasure of working with FAST briefly in terms of introducing the work to conversations with Washington, DC based IFIs, which is where I'm based. My remarks are given in a personal capacity, and they're framed by a risk management perspective. So looking at how bilateral and multilateral development finance institutions, which is a diverse group, handle human rights risks. That would include modern slavery, human trafficking risks, obviously, in the projects that they support, in the sense of the application of social and environmental safeguard policies and the accountability mechanisms that have arisen to ensure that those policies are implemented in practice. That's admittedly a narrow framing, and at the outset, I don't want to lose sight of the extremely important roles that DFIs, development finance institutions, play in a larger sense in potentially being agents for economic empowerment of victims and survivors, and also helping through genuinely inclusive development to eliminate the conditions that create vulnerability to modern slavery, human trafficking in the first place. And I just want to point to the FAST Initiative's excellent report, Developing Freedom in that regard, led by James Cocaine. It's really setting out very well and very comprehensively that larger canvas in which remedy forms one part. In approaching this topic, I do so with humility for a couple of reasons. One is the very concrete and important work just presented in relation to Survivor Inclusion Initiative, Survivor Bank Initiative. I fear that what I'm about to set out might be slightly abstract by comparison, but in order to mitigate that risk, I'll zoom in as quickly as I can on a couple of project illustrations from a DFI and from an Equator Bank project financing institution that I think illustrate in powerful ways how a forward-leaning, proactive approach to remedy predicated upon the idea of responsibility for impacts, as Leona just introduced, can really make a difference in people's lives. And this conversation is framed very much increasingly within the scope of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, and the idea that financial actors, companies need to exercise due diligence to avoid impacts, and also take responsibility for contributing to remedy where they've contributed to impacts. That's an idea that is now just being discussed in DFI's setting. It's been much easier until now to talk about enabling remedy as in a larger sense, and then the idea of enabling remedy ushers in a broader spectrum of actors into the picture. It's a kind of a forward-looking concept. The idea of providing remedy has created difficulties in the conversation in the sense that it conjures images of remedy as a blame game, a finger-pointing game, as something that's unduly reactive. And we're seeing progress in that idea, however, in a really important review process that's underway within the International Finance Corporation at the moment, where they are examining this question in the light of quite a number of cases of human rights violations occurring in relation to IFC-supported projects in which people did not ultimately access remedy. I think that's the unfortunate state of affairs in the DFI financing world, and I think largely any serious human rights violations, it's where you see effective remedy is very much the exception to the rule. So the review process is currently underway and came out with a couple of important recommendations, including recommendations that IFC and MIGA, the Multilateral Investment Guarantee Agency, define a framework for remedial action, contingency liability funding requirements, such as insurance and performance bond arrangements, and draft a policy on the use of IFC and MIGA resources to contribute to remedy in appropriate cases. The report notes that a lot of work lies ahead in terms of defining the criteria and circumstances in which IFC contribution to remedy might be warranted. But just to home in on a couple of examples in practice of where banks, I think, have really done a lot and achieved a lot in individual cases to enable remedy in people's lives. The first one, I think, is the most striking example, is the World Bank, which contributed $198 million to a large public transport development project in Uganda several years ago. 7 roads being upgraded. The project was rated category B according to the World Bank safeguard system. So that's risks that are not of the most severe order, yet in labor influx projects of this kind, in a context where sexual exploitation and abuse is prevalent, I think was subsequently appreciated that was too low a risk rating. And indeed, those types of impacts did happen. Gender-based violence, child labor problems, resettlement problems, girls falling out of school, teenage girls falling out of school due to pregnancy and the like, really serious, irremediable impacts. And what it led to was quite a stunning reparations effort on the part of the bank, beginning with an apology, beginning with a public recognition in 2015 that the bank had fallen down on the job in this case. It's put in place $1.5 million of trust fund money. That's not a tool that all DFIs have in the toolbox, of course, but that trust fund money went into a child protection project and response project, psychosocial services, medical support services, education, livelihood support, and the like, and also support for developing grievance mechanisms around these types of projects. There was a range of other measures taken as well, such as performance bonds in relation to the work of the environmental social impacts of the work of contractors on this project, an entire portfolio review in the country of child labor and SEA, sexual exploitation and abuse issues in the bank's portfolio, revision of standard bidding documents, extension of the sanctions regime to address issues of these kinds, a support for advocacy for prosecutions in relation to criminal offences that occurred in relation to the issues I've mentioned, and critically, a capacity building component as well, wherein the bank supported the Uganda National Roads Authority to develop better practices to engage with risks in these kinds of areas. And that had spin-off effects for future projects of that kind. So when one looks at that picture, although that's just very much a snapshot, it paints a picture of a very holistic approach to remedy involving reparations, compensation, satisfaction. So that's the apology, which is can be a powerful part of the empowerment of victims of violations of this kind, and guarantees of non-repetition, amending policies and practices that prevent violations of that kind from occurring in the future. Very briefly, a second, even shorter snapshot before I conclude. And this, the ANZ's investment in Phnom Penh sugar in Cambodia some years ago, between 2011-14. I know the FAST initiative has studied and discussed this example in its literature on remedy. But that also has one or two noteworthy features. First of all, it was again a case where the bank, ANZ Bank in this case, quite clearly fell down on its due diligence and failed to properly address the resettlement risks and other types of risks, child labor risks, deaths of workers incurring due to working conditions, poor working conditions on the plantation. And it acknowledged that fact, so that element of satisfaction, apology for those omissions. It engaged in a process following a complaint by civil society organizations to the OECD NCP mechanism in Australia that Leona also just alluded to. That is a very modest mechanism on its face. Mediation services essentially provided, but through a 4 to 5 year mediation effort, which is not a short time, regrettably, but through that effort, an agreement was reached in February last year, through which ANZ would take the gross profits of its lending to Phnom Penh Sugar and return those profits to communities through the civil society organizations that brought the complaint. So the compensation element and satisfaction element of remedy in a human rights sense were there, as well as non-repetition. ANZ also committed to review its policies to strengthen its screening mechanisms for these types of risks. And I think what is a first for a commercial bank to establish an independent accountability mechanism. And I think ABN AMRO is also on its way in that regard to looking at an independent accountability mechanism in relation to its for its commercial clients. And I think that is a very promising avenue to be explored. And one is thinking about what the larger remedy ecosystem for modern slavery and human trafficking risks might look like going forward. And I think critically as well, it's important to think of these mechanisms and potentially many others in context. I think it's a point made by Sarah in her remarks earlier, and also with an eye towards the very specific challenges presented by human slavery and modern trafficking risks, which are often very buried very deeply in supply chains. And when one thinks of the DFI's approach to these issues, as the Developing Freedom Report of FAST points out, there are some challenges in this regard, and the safeguard policies of most of the finance institutions don't seem to set very high ambitions in terms of encouraging due diligence from the banks beyond primary suppliers. It's one issue that perhaps needs to be addressed, and some banks are already looking at. So many challenges, certainly, but there are certainly examples of where banks with a forward-leaning posture, driven by a sense of responsibility, anchored in UN guiding principles on business and human rights, framing of the issue, have made a real positive impact in people's lives. And if I were thinking of maybe one area at the invitation of Danielle where maybe the FAST initiative might look at going forward, it's to study this further, but in a multi-stakeholder setting, to bring not only banks together, but also civil society, labor union representatives together, and to analyze more closely with the FAST's work on remedy already as a starting point, the respects in which finance sector actors can enable and contribute to remedy in practice guided by these principles. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you to all of our panelists for such a fantastic contribution to this very wide-ranging conversation. Daniel, I will be dependent upon you to identify any questions in the room. We did have one question in the chat, which came from Teresa Forbes. I think that Barry covered this. Teresa asks, she'd be interested to learn more about equity beyond just access to a bank account. What are the challenges with helping survivors have access and equity in loans, or to build small businesses or buy homes? And how are these challenges being addressed to make the remedy more holistic? From my perspective, I think that we covered that question, but if anyone would like to add to that from the panelists, please go ahead. Tamaya, I see a hand up.
I would like to thank you, Teresa, for that question. And though I heard the answer from Barry and financial sector's perspective, and I greatly agree and respect that, would like to give you some thoughts on challenges from the survival's perspective. I started a company 7 years ago, and I wasn't qualified for bank loans or anything, because most applications are asking for your qualification, for your experience or years of experience in the field. And being a survival of human trafficking is not actually an experience that society are accepting as such an experience. So even though we are including survival voices in many conversations, we are still a little bit behind on when it comes to recognizing and putting a dollar sign or a cost to paying survivors for their consulting time. So when I was asked by specifically one bank, why do I charge the rates that I charge? I explained to them it was 20 years of, 15 years of, 3 months of surviving human trafficking, 15 years of surviving the experience of being trafficked, and another 5 years of learning by myself how to start a business. The answer was from the bank is that we simply don't see the value in your time and experiences, and we don't believe that those prices should be paid, or we don't believe that your company actually would be able to make those revenues. So the lived experience is not accepted in any application forms. And so that being said, we usually have years and years of gap on our resumes that we can't really explain. So I think when it comes to looking for gaps in the system, that would be one of them, to just kind of look for the create resumes based on transferable skills. So James was a child labor survival who was on our panel. He was working for 8 years in the mines. He actually worked. He had a job. He had skills. He built a lot of skills, but because that area of his life was completely taken off, technically 8 years later, he had technically no skills and no background. So I think that would be another area where we could improve a little bit and say, okay, I understand you were a victim of whatever form of modern day slavery. How can we translate and transfer your skills from that time into current application forms? I hope that was helpful. Thank you very much for hearing me out.
Thank you, Tamaya. Would anyone else like to add to that? No, thank you. So, Daniel, I'll go to the room. If there are any questions in the conference.
Leona, happy to be your long arm into Fiducia here, but thanks already so far. I can see Helen Taylor from the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery, please.
Thank you. Yes, I'm already holding the microphone. First of all, I really appreciate this session so much, getting back to the core of why we are all here at the end of the day, and the lives that we're trying to help support. I also appreciated all the panelists that said, what more can we do? And I guess my question is really about survivors that will never touch formal banking institutions. We know that there are many victims of modern slavery, particularly in the global South, that where credit is not the issue. It's just about accessing finance at the most basic levels. So I was wondering if there has been any thought or action taken towards that. And then a second question, I know that this goal is around effective remedy, but as you were talking about the inclusive loans and other financial products, our research has shown that's really actually helpful as a preventive measure. So also thinking about how do we expand access to groups around loans for migration, so they're not, borrowing from loan sharks, or providing life or health insurance products, because oftentimes illness or death in the family is a triggering event that leads to exploitation. And any comments around that would be really appreciated. Thank you.
Helen, certainly on the second point, we, in the blueprint, we addressed this issue. We haven't seen any activities now from our side yet, but that may be something that could be very interesting for the future, especially if we have a partner to work with, if I may say that also. Yes, anyone who wants Shai on this question, answering to this question? Then let's wait with the next question for a second. Any views on the issues raised by Helen? Leona, do you want to take over? Can I give back to you to Liverpool now?
Thank you, Daniel. I think Barry has his hand up.
Yes, thanks. And hello, Daniel. Nice to see you as always. So I will address the first point, which is a point on which there is vehement agreement. The need to find a path into the non-traditional payments sector is something that we have talked about. We have talked about digital payments, and it hasn't been a conversation just in passing. It's been a substantive conversation. We intend to go there. We have prioritized and sequenced some of the nearer term goals, but you're 100% correct about different financial remittances, different behaviors in different parts of the world. We're very much aware of that and would like to find a digital solution, and we intend to explore that in the future.
Just follow up, Barry, you mentioned already that we're thinking about an expansion of the Survivor Inclusion Initiative to Latin America. Before we will consider that, and we have spoken to jurisdictions, international organizations present in the region, we will first do, assess and analyze the market. What may be a bank account in the US, maybe something different in Mexico, what may be something, realistically achievable for survivors in Mexico, maybe something different in Trinidad and Tobago. So that's enormously important to think of the local context. What does actually finance mean in a given region or country? Yeah. Vanessa.
Yeah, I'm just thinking aloud now that we're, as part of our other pieces of work, we obviously look at how we can make sure that everybody has access. So there's lots of different people are in different situations for different reasons and different life events. And one of the things that I've been talking about internally at the moment is that actually we've got our basic bank account, but that there will be certain demographics that actually even that will not suit. So what we should be doing is looking to partner with other financial services or providers, credit unions as an example, or it might be that we don't ultimately have the answer, and that's fine, but we should be able to signpost customers to other people to support. So I think that's key to remember as well. We don't have to have the answer all the time. It's about that collaboration as well.
Thank you.
Thank you, Vanessa. Tamaya has her hand up, Daniel.
Thank you so much. As a huge fan of the blueprint, I read it cover to cover many times, and I would like to just suggest that and unfortunately I can't remember which page it is. I used to know the blueprint by page, but towards the 3/4 of the blueprint that we created, there is actually a case study about a digital payment solution study and a test that was run, I believe, in South Asia, where 100,000 individuals, either 1,000 individuals being freed from modern day slavery were given a digital payment solution, and it 100% increased their self-esteem, self-confidence, and they were no longer vulnerable to further trafficking and further to that. They were also given microloans, and those microloans were turned into self-sustaining micro businesses. And so I think the question that you raised is a great question. I think according to the blueprint, there has been some projects in South Asia that were extremely successful, and I have no doubt that Barry, with his leadership and with Danielle's help, we will be able to find more of those and find a way to kind of implement that. Thank you so much.
There was one more question from the room, Leona, if you allow me. It's from Sheikh Goye from the Liechtenstein Development Agency.
Yeah, thank you for your very insightful talks and inputs. Actually, the question of Helen, I would have just a very short answer to that, or a very short input to that. In the morning session, I was alluding to the necessity of bringing in other sectors, namely international development and cooperation sector, into the initiative. And I think that in that particular concrete example of that Helen just brought, we could think of actually that sector coming in and with a really sustainable project that would go beyond just opening bank account, that will actually go towards, for example, allowing those people to have, supporting those people so that they can have income generating activities. And also while doing that, having always in mind project that would be sustainable. Yeah. I have a short question actually relating to the challenges about identifying those victims of human trafficking. And here I have just two concrete cases that could actually arise. The one case is we may have a victim who does not consider himself or herself as a victim, because the activity that she's actually doing, she helps her to survive. Yeah. We may have a second case where a person does consider herself a victim, but does not plan to be making a coming out of different reasons. Yeah. How do you go about that? How do you go about, these are just two concrete cases, but how do you go in general about identifying the challenges that are relating to identify?
Thank you.
Ivana, back to you.
Thank you for that question. I think that Sarah and Tamaya both would like to come in on that. If I can bring Sarah in. And then Tamaya.
Yeah, so the issue of, survivors not always identifying as trafficking survivors, I mean, that is a constant challenge in the anti-trafficking field. It's very, very common for survivors not to identify as trafficking victims. And on the hotline, certainly I spoke to many people who were calling the hotline, but at the same time saying that they were not necessarily a trafficking victim. I would say a couple of things. One, I think it's really important to use the language that resonates with the population that you're speaking to. So they may not have the label of trafficking survivor, trafficking victim, but you may be able to say something like, has your boss ever threatened to hurt you if you tried to quit? Something like that, that's a little more accessible. And if they say yes to that, then that's somebody who has experienced trafficking. So kind of how you're framing it to the audience, I think, is incredibly important. And I would also say that to working closely with organizations that work in allied spaces or related spaces, I think is very critical, because a survivor may not see themselves as a trafficking survivor. Maybe they see themselves as a victim of domestic violence. So they're getting access from a domestic violence organization. If that organization is kind of brought into the conversation, aware of this initiative, then they may still be able to make that referral for that person. And then secondly, many trafficking survivors, you're absolutely right, are not always, there's a process that goes into making the determination to leave. It's something that I think, we have to work with very closely on the hotline. A lot of people call to hear about their options, to start thinking through what exit might look like for them. And I think that's just something where, you have to be quite patient of providing people with information, providing people with ideas of what it might look like to exit, talking through what the different options are, letting someone decide kind of what would be best for them. And then, over time, there's that kind of contemplation process that many people will eventually feel like they have a plan together and be able to make that decision. But that's just something that we have to, I think, be very aware of and very open to, continuing to present what opportunities are out there for people. So when they're ready, they're able to take advantage of them.
Thank you. Tamaya.
Thank you so much, Sarah, for that incredible answer. And thank you to the gentleman in the room. I'm sorry I couldn't hear your name through the Zoom. Incredibly great, insightful question. Very much celebrated from the service providers world, given the fact that you're coming from the financial sector. So I just want to add to that a little bit. I think it's very important to know that there's different stages of healing. So when a survivor, there's still a stage where we call it the victim. I used to do victim service work myself for 6 years. So the mindset of a victim that you are indicating are still most likely potentially are in a situation, and they haven't fully came out of the situation, just like Sarah mentioned, right? That means they were not are not fully ready to exit. So that means when they do exit, the first stages of healing and responses that they need is actually not necessarily a bank account that would just come a little bit later. So that's why I love the structure that was built into the survival initiative, that they work with victim service providers, and these are the victim service providers who are going to have to make that decision if this individual is ready or is already in need of receiving a bank account or not. And so luckily, you as a bank teller or as a financial sector, you don't have to worry about that part, because that will be taken care of by the service providers. Just one thing to know, that if you, for example, give too much, too fast, too soon to a survivor who's not ready yet, it actually just could backfire, and that bank account or bank card could very much end up in the hands of the trafficker again. So that's why those steps are put in place to protect you as financial sectors and to protect the victims. And that's where victim service agencies and Salvation Army comes in place. Thank you.
Thank you, Tamaya. I think that also within that answer, you touched on a very important issue which has come through quite strongly, which is the interrelationship between remedy and prevention. Not only prevention of re-victimization of survivors and victims, but prevention for vulnerable populations from being trafficked or experiencing slavery at all. We are now coming to the end of this session. Daniel, I'm assuming there's no more questions in the room. I'd just like to thank everybody for their contributions to this really important aspect of FAST's work, and hand back over to you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Leona, for putting together the panel, moderating. Thanks for all of you. I'm sure there are more questions. The problem is we have no more time. So, but that shows what I tried to say initially, is this topic is of particular importance for us. This is not the last time we speak about that, and I think much more needs to be said about it. So thank you very much.